My husband of 31 years looked across the dinner table at our son and daughter-in-law, raised his wine glass and laughed. Your mother couldn't balance a checkbook if her life depended on it. Nobody corrected him. Not our son Brendan, not our daughter-in-law, not even me. I just reached for my water glass and stared at the candles I had lit that evening, the same candles I'd been lighting every Friday night for 3 decades, and thought, how many more Fridays am I going to sit here disappearing? People always ask me when I knew my marriage was over. They expect a dramatic answer, a slammed door, a discovery. But the truth is quieter than that. My marriage didn't end in one moment. It ended the way a sweater unravels, one loose thread at a time, so slowly you don't notice until you're holding nothing but string. When I met my husband Philip at 26, I was working as a seamstress at a small alterations shop in downtown Victoria, British Columbia. I had trained under a woman named Constance Webb who used to say that a perfectly tailored garment was just confidence made visible. I believed her. Back then, I believed a lot of things. Philip was charming in that particular way some men are. The kind where the charm feels personal, like it was made specifically for you. He would stop by the shop on his lunch break, not to drop off clothing but just to talk to me. He remembered things, that I took my coffee black, that I preferred rain over sunshine, that my mother had taught me to sew on a machine older than she was. You're wasted in that little shop, he used to tell me, leaning against the counter like I owned the place. You could do so much more. I was 27 when we married. Philip had just been promoted at the engineering firm where he worked. And within a year we had moved to a suburb outside of Vancouver, and I had stopped working at Constance Webb's shop. Philip said it made more sense financially, that my income barely covered the cost of commuting, that once we had children, I would want to be home anyway. It all sounded so reasonable at the time. Our son Brendan came along 18 months later. Then our daughter Miriam 2 years after that. And just like that, 30 years passed in the particular way that domestic life moves, loudly, when the children are small, then quietly once they leave, until one day you look up and realize the house is full of someone else's taste, someone else's schedule, someone else's version of who you are. Philip became very successful. He rose to partner at his firm. We moved into a larger home in Burnaby with granite countertops and a double garage, and one of those open-concept kitchens I never asked for but spent 15 years cooking in. People liked Philip. At church gatherings, at neighborhood barbecues, at Brendan's hockey tournaments, everyone seemed to like Philip. He was the kind of man who gave firm handshakes and remembered your name. What they didn't see was the Philip who questioned every purchase I made. How much did those curtains cost? He'd ask, not because we couldn't afford them, but because the question itself was the point. Because making me justify ordinary decisions was how he reminded us both who was in charge. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, maybe 12 years into our marriage, holding a receipt for a winter coat I had bought on clearance at the Bay. Philip looked at it and shook his head slowly. We're trying to save for the renovation, Margaret. I wanted to point out that the coat was $63, and he had just spent $400 on new golf clubs, but I didn't. I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket and said nothing. That became my specialty over the years, saying nothing. By the time Brendan married his wife Tamsin and Miriam moved to Halifax for graduate school, I had become, in Philip's words and in my own quiet understanding of myself, someone who managed the household. That was the phrase he used. Margaret manages the household. As though I were a building superintendent. As though 30 years of raising children, maintaining our home, hosting his colleagues, supporting his career, and keeping every invisible thread of our family from unraveling deserved exactly that much credit. It was a Sunday dinner, the kind we still had every few weeks even after the children left, that things finally cracked open. Brendan and Tamsin were visiting. I had spent most of the day cooking. Roast chicken, roasted root vegetables, homemade bread, a blueberry crumble from the last of the summer berries I had frozen in September. Philip poured more wine and leaned back in his chair, that particular posture he took when he felt most comfortable, most like himself. Brendan had been talking about a colleague of his who had recently left a long career to start a small business. Good for him, Philip said. Takes guts. Then he glanced at me and smiled. Not everyone has that kind of spine, of course. Tamsin looked at her plate. Brendan picked up his fork. Your mother, for instance. Philip gestured vaguely in my direction. Couldn't survive a week in the real world? Could you, Margaret? The room went very still. I had heard versions of this before. The implication that the life I had built was not real. That my contribution was decoration rather than structure. But something about the way he said it that night, casually, almost fondly, the way you might tease a child, made something inside me go quiet in a different way than usual. Not wounded. Decided. I smiled at him. I said, "You're probably right." And I watched the satisfaction move across his face like warm water. He nodded, poured more wine, and changed the subject to interest rates. I did the dishes alone. Tamsin offered to help, but I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was listening to the television in the other room, to Philip's voice, explaining something about the housing market to Brendan, and I was thinking about a tin box I hadn't opened in more than 20 years. That night, after they left and Philip fell asleep, I lay in the dark for a long time. 31 years. I kept coming back to that number. 31 years of making myself small enough to fit comfortably inside someone else's idea of who I should be. I got up at 2 a.m. and went to the sewing room. We called it the sewing room, though I hadn't sewn anything in it for years. It had gradually become a storage space. Boxes from house moves we never fully unpacked, old tax files, the overflow of a life not quite organized enough to throw away. But in the back of the closet, behind a box of Miriam's old schoolwork, I knew there was a large plastic storage bin I had not opened since we moved to this house 17 years earlier. I pulled it out and sat on the floor in the dark and opened it. Inside was everything from before. Fabric samples, pattern books, some of them so old the pages had gone gold at the edges. My old sewing journals, where I used to sketch designs and write notes about fit and construction. A plastic sleeve of photographs from my time at the shop. Me at the cutting table. Me fitting a wedding gown on a client. Constance Webb standing behind me with her hands on my shoulders, looking like she was about to say something I needed to hear. And beneath all of it, wrapped in tissue paper the color of old cream, were 3 garments I had made myself in my late 20s. A fitted wool blazer in a deep teal. A structured skirt with hand-sewn button detail. A blouse in a fine ivory cotton, the collar so precisely made that even now, 25 years later, it looked like something from a boutique window. I unfolded the blazer and held it in my lap. I had been good. I remembered now, sitting on that floor in the middle of the night, that I had actually been very good. Constance Webb used to send clients specifically to me. She used to say my eye for fit was something she had never been able to teach, that I either had it or I didn't, and I did. I had, once, believed I was going to open my own alterations and bespoke tailoring studio. I had even had a name picked out. Second Skin. I told Philip about it once, in the early years, and he had smiled and said, "Sure, sweetheart, someday." And someday had become never so gently I hadn't even noticed. I sat there for a long time with the blazer across my lap. Then I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling and made a decision I didn't tell anyone about yet. The next morning, after Philip left for the office, I drove across the city to a neighborhood in East Vancouver, where I knew a woman named Constance Webb's former assistant. A woman I had stayed loosely in touch with over the years through Christmas cards and the occasional email. Her name was Ingrid Paulson, and she had opened her own small fabric and notions shop on Commercial Drive about 8 years earlier. I hadn't been inside the shop before. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking at the sign above the door, Paulson Textiles, and thought about turning around. Women my age weren't supposed to start over. That was the message, quiet and constant, that society had been sending me for years. You survive. You tend to others. You grow smaller and more grateful until one day the whole thing is finished. But I pushed open the door. Ingrid Paulson looked up from behind the counter. She had the same sharp, direct gaze I remembered from years ago, and she had aged with the kind of comfortable confidence that comes from spending decades doing exactly what you mean to do. "Margaret," she said, like I had been in the week before. "Ingrid," I said, "I think I need to start sewing again." She looked at me for a moment. Then she put down the bolt of linen she was holding and said, "Come and have some tea and tell me everything." I stayed for 2 hours. I told her about Philip, about the 31 years, about the dinner, about the blazer on my lap at 2 a.m. Ingrid listened, the way people do when they are not waiting for a pause to insert their own thoughts. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you still have your machine?" she asked. "Somewhere," I said. "In a closet. Then you have everything you need to start." She refilled my cup. "The rest is just practice." What happened next frightened me more than I expected. I drove home and found the sewing machine, a good Bernina I had bought in my early 30s and almost never used since, in the back of the guest room closet. I set it up on the dining room table. I pressed fabric. I threaded the needle, and the moment the machine began to run under my hands, something in my body remembered before my mind had the chance to be afraid. The rhythm, the concentration, the particular silence of complete attention. I cried a little, right there at the dining room table with the machine running and the afternoon light coming through the windows, not sad tears. The kind that come when something long buried surfaces unexpectedly. Over the following weeks, I began sewing in the hours Philip was at work. I remade 2 garments from fabric I found at Ingrid's shop. I altered a coat I'd had for 15 years that had never fit quite right. I made a pair of wide-legged trousers in a charcoal wool that, when I put them on and looked in the mirror, made me feel like someone I had not been in a very long time. Myself. Philip noticed I seemed quieter than usual. "You're still upset about dinner," he said one evening, not asking but declaring, the way he always declared things about me. "I'm fine," I told him. "You've always been oversensitive," he said. "It's one of your things." He picked up the newspaper and that was the end of the conversation. I went to the sewing room and cut fabric for another 2 hours. It was Ingrid who first suggested I sell anything. A mutual acquaintance had admired a jacket I was wearing, one of my own makes, and asked where I'd bought it. When I told her I'd made it, she wanted to know if I made things for other people. "Not anymore," I said. "Not for years." "But you could," said Ingrid matter-of-factly. "You should." I laughed it off. I was 61 years old. I hadn't worked professionally in 3 decades. The idea of rebuilding something from that felt enormous and probably foolish. In the same week, going through an old filing cabinet looking for a warranty document, I found something that stopped me cold. A folder I didn't recognize, tucked between our mortgage renewal papers and old insurance documents. Inside were bank statements. Not our joint account, a separate account in Philip's name only, at a different institution. I stood in the home office with the folder in my hands and looked at the balance. Just over $280,000. My hands went cold. Philip had always told me we needed to be careful. That retirement was coming and we had to be disciplined. He questioned the cost of my haircuts. He reviewed the grocery receipts. He managed all of our investments and told me regularly that things were tight, that we had to be sensible. And tucked behind the mortgage papers was a private account with nearly $300,000 that I had never been told about. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. I did not confront Philip. I went back to Ingrid's shop the next morning and asked her if she knew a good family lawyer. She wrote a name on the back of a receipt. Wendy Okafor practiced family law out of a modest office in Kitsilano. She was in her early 50s with natural gray locks and the particular calm of someone who had heard every version of this story and never once stopped taking it seriously. I sat across from her desk and told her about the account. "How long have you been married?" she asked. 31 years. "Is this the only account you didn't know about?" "I don't know," I said. "I thought I knew everything. I'm realizing I may not know very much at all." Wendy nodded slowly. "In a marriage of this length," she said carefully, "a stay-at-home spouse has significant legal protections regarding marital assets. Your contribution to this marriage is recognized under family law. You did not earn less than your husband. You earned differently." I had not realized how badly I needed someone to say that until she said it. She gave me a list: tax returns, property records, investment account statements. Any documents I could locate without arousing suspicion. "Don't confront him yet," she said. "People who have been hiding money tend to move it quickly when they feel exposed." The drive home took 40 minutes. I spent it thinking about 31 years in a different way than I ever had before. Over the following 3 weeks, I became someone Philip had never imagined I could be. Methodical, observant, careful. I photographed documents. I noted account numbers. I searched files I had been told were just paperwork I didn't need to worry about. What I found was worse than the single account. There were transfers. Steady, deliberate transfers over several years, moved into accounts that weren't connected to anything I had access to. And when I dug further, I found a property record for a small rental unit in Kelowna. A condominium purchased 4 years earlier that I had never been told about. Philip had been collecting rental income on a property that didn't exist in any version of our shared finances. The night I found the property record, Philip came home and poured himself a scotch and asked what was for dinner. I made pasta. We ate together. He talked about a project at the office, and I listened and nodded and thought, "You have been living a double life inside mine for years, and you never once expected me to notice, because you were completely certain I was too dependent to look." That certainty was about to become the most expensive mistake he ever made. Wendy called me 2 weeks later and asked me to come in. She had brought in a financial investigator to review the documents I had collected. I sat in her office while she walked me through what they had found. "The transfers are significant," she said, "and the Kelowna property appears to have been purchased using funds drawn from a joint line of credit that was never fully disclosed on your shared tax filings." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," Wendy said carefully, "that your husband has been systematically redirecting marital assets for at least 6 years, possibly longer." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "There's more," she said. She slid a document across the desk. It was a refinancing agreement for our current home, dated 3 years earlier. My signature was on it. I had never signed it. I looked at Wendy. "We had a document examiner look at this," she said. "The signature does not match verified samples from your legal records." I pressed my hand flat against the desk to steady myself. "He forged my signature. The evidence strongly supports that conclusion, yes." I don't remember driving home that afternoon. I remember sitting in the car outside our house for a long time, looking at the front door, the garden I had planted and tended for 17 years, the window boxes I had filled every spring with geraniums. He had built an escape plan, quietly, deliberately, while I made dinner and tended the garden, and sat across from him at Friday night dinners and told myself this was just what long marriages looked like. The anger that moved through me then was not the hot, loud kind. It was cold and clear and surprisingly clean. I was done apologizing for existing. The night I finally told Ingrid everything, the accounts, the property, the forged signature, she sat very still across the work table in her back room and listened. When I finished, she refilled her tea. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm leaving him," I said. "I have a lawyer. I have everything she needs." I paused. "And I think I need to start selling my work." Ingrid looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a small, polite smile, a real one. "I have a proposal," she said. She had been approached recently by the organizer of a local maker's market, a monthly indoor market in a heritage building on Granville Island. She had a booth, but couldn't fill it alone. She proposed we split the space. I would bring clothing and bespoke alterations. She would bring fabric and notions. Together, we might actually fill the table. "I haven't sold anything professionally in 30 years, I reminded her. "You haven't done a lot of things in 30 years that you're about to start doing," she said. She wasn't wrong. The morning Philip received the divorce papers, he came downstairs holding them like they were something that had arrived by mistake. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and did not get up. "Margaret," his voice was even. Trolled. "Good morning," I said. He set the papers on the table. "What is this?" "You know what it is. This is completely unnecessary." He pulled out a chair and sat down like we were about to have a reasonable discussion. "If you're upset about something, we can talk about it." "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm done." He stared at me. "You don't understand what you're doing. The financial implications alone." "My lawyer understands the financial implications very well," I said. "Including the Kelowna property." The color left his face. "And the transfers," I added. "And the refinancing agreement I didn't sign." Silence. Then Philip said, very quietly, "You couldn't have found all of that yourself. You spent 30 years assuming I wasn't paying attention," I said. "That turned out to be a significant miscalculation." He left the room. I finished my coffee. The first Granville Island market fell on a Saturday in early March. I had barely slept the night before. I arrived at the Heritage Building at 7 in the morning, with 3 garment bags, a portable hanging rack, and a basket of accessories I had made over the past month. Linen pouches, fabric-covered headbands, small zippered bags in coordinating prints. Ingrid was already there, arranging bolts of fabric along the back of the booth. She handed me a coffee without being asked. "Ready?" she said. "Absolutely not," I said. She laughed. "Perfect." By 10 o'clock, 3 people had stopped to ask about the blazer on the display form. By noon, I had sold 2 garments and taken deposits on 3 custom alterations. One woman, perhaps 70, held a wool coat of mine against herself and said, "This looks like something made by someone who actually knows what a woman's body looks like." I laughed more genuinely than I had in years. Around 2 in the afternoon, I looked up from measuring a hem length for a customer and saw Philip across the market hall. He was with a woman I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 10 years younger than me, and she was laughing at something he had said. They were not browsing the market. They were walking through it, unhurried, like it was an ordinary Saturday. I watched them for a moment. Then I went back to measuring the hem. When the customer left, Ingrid appeared beside me. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, somewhere between arriving at that market hall at 7 in the morning with garment bags over my arm and measuring a hem for a woman who wanted her favorite coat to fit properly again. I had stopped needing Philip's version of me to be false in order for my own version to feel true. He was irrelevant to who I was becoming, and realizing that was something close to peace. Philip did not approach the booth. He saw me. I know he saw me, but he walked past with the woman and disappeared into the next hall. An hour later, a mutual acquaintance named Douglas stopped by the booth and looked at my work, and said, warmly and without subtext, "Margaret, this is wonderful." I thanked him and sold him a linen scarf for his wife. That evening, driving home, I added up what I had made. $412. Not a fortune. Not a revelation. But mine, entirely and completely mine, for the first time in 3 decades. I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. The house felt different lately. Quieter in a way that was starting to become something other than lonely. My phone rang. "Miriam, calling from Halifax. Brendan told me," she said. Her voice was careful. "About the divorce. I was going to call you this week," I said. "Mum." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I think I might be better than okay," I said. "I think I might be just starting." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad called me. He said you'd had some kind of episode." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Of course he did." "I didn't believe him," she said quickly. "I want you to know that. I didn't believe him for 1 second. That meant more than I could easily explain. Because Miriam had grown up in the same house I had. She had watched the same patterns, heard the same dismissals, absorbed the same quiet lesson that her father's words carried more weight than her mother's. And she had chosen, just then, to override that lesson entirely. "Thank you," I said softly. "Can I come home?" she asked. "Next month. Can I come and see what you're building?" The word stopped me completely. Building. She had called it building. "Yes," I said. "Please come." The divorce process moved more quickly once Wendy presented the full financial picture. Philip's lawyer negotiated cautiously, which told me everything I needed to know about how exposed Philip knew himself to be. There were no criminal charges ultimately. An agreement was reached, restitution was made, settlements were negotiated. I will not pretend it was clean or without pain. It was neither, but it was, eventually, finished. I moved into a smaller place in the Commercial Drive neighborhood, a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a house, with good natural light and a second room large enough to set up a proper sewing studio. The building was old. The radiators made noise. The kitchen was half the size of the one I had left behind. I loved it immediately. The first night alone, I sat on the floor of the empty studio, eating takeout pho from the Vietnamese restaurant 3 doors down, and looked at the bare walls and thought, I am 61 years old and I am beginning again. The thought was terrifying. It was also, quietly, thrilling. Ingrid helped me set up the studio properly over the following weeks. She knew suppliers, she knew equipment, she knew the names of other local makers who might want to collaborate or share clients. She introduced me to a woman named Petra Sundqvist, who ran a small sustainable fashion atelier out of a space near Main Street and was looking for someone to take on overflow tailoring clients. "She's very particular," Ingrid warned me before the introduction. "Don't let that put you off." Petra Sundqvist was indeed very particular. She was perhaps 45, Swedish-Canadian, with an aesthetic that was elegant and spare and uncompromising. She looked at my portfolio, photographs of my recent work plus the 3 original garments I had made in my 20s, for a long time without speaking. "The blazer," she said finally. "You made this 25 years ago?" "About that," I said. "The collar construction is exceptional." She looked up. "Why did you stop?" I gave her the short version. She listened without expression. "I have 12 clients waiting for tailoring appointments," she said when I finished. "Can you start next week?" Just like that. The work with Petra brought a different kind of client. Women who cared deeply about the relationship between a garment and the body wearing it. Women who had worn things that didn't fit for years and had almost forgotten what it felt like when something did. I understood that feeling in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. Within 3 months, I had a waiting list of my own. It happened gradually, then suddenly, the way these things do. The Granville Island market became a regular fixture. Petra referred clients. Ingrid's shop became a kind of informal headquarters, where local makers gathered and word passed between them. I started teaching a Saturday morning class in her back room. Basic tailoring for beginners. Mostly women, mostly over 40. Mostly people who had put something aside long ago and were finding their way back to it. I didn't intend for the class to become what it became. The first session had 5 students. By the 3rd month, there was a wait list. One morning, arriving early to set up, I found a handwritten note tucked under the studio door. A woman I had taught the week before had written to tell me she was going to an interview that afternoon in an altered blazer she had brought back to life herself. "I feel like myself again," the note said. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I kept the note on my cutting table for a long time. Philip texted me occasionally in the months following the divorce. At first, the messages were brief and transactional. Questions about old accounts, shared property items, administrative things. Then they shifted. He had heard I was selling my work. He had heard about the classes. He had heard my name mentioned somewhere. "I'm glad things are going well for you," one text said. It was not, I noticed, the same thing as an apology. Brendan came to see me about 4 months after I moved out. He stood in the doorway of the studio for a moment before coming in, looking at the cutting tables and fabric bolts and the organized rows of thread I had arranged along one wall. "Mom," he said, This is really something. Come in," I said. "Mind the pins on the floor." We sat in the small sitting area off the studio with tea, and for a while we talked about ordinary things. His work, Tamsin, the neighborhood. Then Brendan set down his cup and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I waited for the dinner." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And for a lot of dinners, honestly." I laughed when I shouldn't have. I stayed quiet when I shouldn't have. I told myself it was just the way Dad talked, but that was. He stopped. That wasn't right. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 40 years old. He looked like he had been carrying this for a while. "You were raised inside it," I said gently. "That changes what feels normal." "I know," he said, "but I was also an adult." He shook his head. "I watched him do it for years and I let him, Brendan." He looked up. "The fact that you're here and saying this," I said, "matters more than I can tell you." He nodded. We were quiet for a moment. Then he looked around the studio again. "Tamsin wants to come. She wants to take one of your classes, actually." That surprised me. "Does she?" He smiled faintly. "She's been talking about getting back to something creative for ages. I think she just needed an excuse." He paused. "I think maybe you gave her one." A few weeks later, Tamsin came to a Saturday class. She sat at the end of the long cutting table and was quieter than the others. At first careful, like someone not entirely sure of her welcome. I set her up with a simple project. Altering a blouse that had never sat quite right on her shoulders. And within an hour she was absorbed, that particular absorption that happens when the hands are doing something true. At the end of the session, she helped me tidy up. We worked in companionable silence for a while. Then she said, not looking up from the table, "I want to apologize for the way things were, for the things I didn't say." "I know," I said. "He was very—" She stopped. "I was afraid of disappointing him." "I know that too," I said. "Philip is very good at making people afraid of disappointing him. That's not your fault." She looked up then, and there was something in her face that I recognized. the expression of someone who has been told a true thing they had been trying not to hear for a long time. "I'm glad you left," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I'm glad you didn't stay." The business grew in the way that honest work grows. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, built on something real. By spring of the following year, I had moved to a proper studio space. A small storefront on Commercial Drive with 2 cutting tables, good light, and a fitting room with a proper 3-way mirror. Ingrid helped me paint the walls. Petra sent flowers for the opening. My Saturday class followed me to the new space and expanded to 2 sessions. I named the studio Second Skin, the name I had chosen 35 years ago and never used. Miriam came home the week of the opening. She stood outside the door reading the sign and then turned around with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a child. Pure, uncomplicated pride. "Mum," she said, "look at this!" "I'm looking," I said. She hugged me on the sidewalk in front of the shop. It was raining, the way it rains in Vancouver in spring, soft and persistent and not particularly cold. We stood there for a moment and I thought, 31 years ago I was 26 and I had a name for a studio I was going to open someday. Someday had just taken a longer route than expected. Philip came by the studio once, about 6 weeks after the opening. I was alone, working on a wedding commission, when I heard the door. He stood just inside the entrance, hands in his coat pockets, looking around at the space. "Margaret," he said. "Philip," I said. I didn't put down my work. He looked at the dressmaker's forms, the bolts of fabric, the framed sketch I had hung near the window, one of my designs from the old journal I had found in the storage bin. "You really built all of this," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard about the waiting list. And the classes." "Good things to hear," I said. He shifted slightly. "I've been thinking." He stopped. "I know I wasn't always easy to live with." I set down my scissors and looked at him. "I know I made things smaller than they should have been," he said. "For you." I waited. "I think I needed you to need me," he said. "And I didn't know how to be around someone who didn't." He looked at the floor briefly. "I know that's not an excuse." "No," I agreed. "It's not." He nodded. He seemed older somehow than he had only a year ago. Tired in a way that wasn't physical. "I genuinely didn't think you would leave," he said. "I spent 30 years assuming you couldn't." "I know you did," I said. He looked around the studio once more. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. "For a long time, I was wrong about you." I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed inside our marriage. The young woman who had once believed in the possibility of this exact room. The exhausted wife who had folded a receipt into her pocket and said nothing. The woman who sat on the floor at 2 a.m, holding a wool blazer she had almost forgotten she'd made. And the woman standing here now, in her own space with a waiting list and a Tuesday class in fabric, ordered from Montreal for a commission that was due in 3 weeks. "You were wrong," I said, "and I almost believed you." We stood in the quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain moved across the window. "Take care of yourself, Philip," I said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply. He nodded once, then he left. I stood alone in the studio for a while after the door closed. Then I went back to the wedding commission, because there was a scene that needed finishing and the client was coming for a fitting on Thursday. And I did not intend to keep her waiting. If there is one thing I can tell you, from the other side of 61 and a 31-year marriage, and a business I built from a storage bin and a sewing machine I found in a closet, it is this. The years you spent taking care of everyone else did not disappear. They did not waste. They became the patience and precision and steadiness that now hold everything you are building. They are not lost time. They are the foundation you laid without knowing what you were laying it for. I thought starting over at 61 was too late. I thought the window had closed while I was looking the other way. But I was measuring time against a life that wasn't mine, against someone else's version of what I was worth. I know my own worth now, not because Philip acknowledged it, though eventually, in his way, he did, but because I walked into a room every morning and made something with my hands that did not exist before I arrived. Because women sat in my classes and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, the particular pride of making something true and well made. Because I looked at a sign above a door in the rain and recognized, finally, the woman it belonged to. Second Skin. Still here, still making things that fit. If this story reached something in you today, if any part of it felt familiar, I would be so grateful to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after someone spent years convincing you that you couldn't? Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? I read every single one.